and demanded he should be able to exercise his right of freedom of movement in accordance with the Human Rights Conventions the UK had ratified. The US, the UK and Australia ignored the UN's calls. How do we make the Australian government then agree to bring Julian home?
Thanks, John. It's a good question, how to make the Australian government bring Julian home to us, which we have thought about a lot. If you remember a couple of years ago, you couldn't get a good word about Julian in the paper, and I couldn't get an appointment to see any MPs. And now, as Greg has just pointed out, there are 24 MPs with a solid core. Also, just a couple of weeks ago, the Australian Senate passed a resolution with the assistance of the Labor Party to make a support for Julian. I think that indicates that we're, moving along a bit. With the Labor Party, they have they've not responded previously, but now they have. And Julian Hill, who's a Labor Party member, is on the committee and speaks strongly in support of Julian. So we have in Melbourne, in 2 electorates, very strong support. We can measure this by people have used our facilities, our email facilities. So we can measure approximately how many people in each electorate that support us. So in the 2 electorates just over the border, there's about 15,000 supporters. In Wentworth in Sydney, there's about 6,000 supporters of Julian. In the 2 electorates that straddle the leader of the Greens electorate, we have very strong similar support. There's 540,000 people who have signed Philip Adams' petition to the government. So this continues to build, and that all of these electorates that I have mentioned are more or less marginal. So that brings intense pressure to the government.
Let me introduce you our 3rd panel member, Kieran O'Reilly. He's an anti-war activist and a staunch Julian Assange campaigner. In 1980, Kieran was associated with the Catholic worker movement in Brisbane, who ran a hospitality house and shop called Justice Producers in West End. He has been an activist in the ploughshare movement, and in 1991, Kieran was jailed in the United States for participating in the ANZUS ploughshare disarmament of B-52 bombers on the Gulf War. In 2003, at the start of the Second Iraq War, he participated in the pitch of ploughshare disarmament of US Navy warplanes and was again jailed. In a significant victory for the ploughshare movement, he and his co-accusers were later acquitted by a Dublin jury and offered 2.1 million damages to the US Navy warplane en route to the invasion of Iraq. In 2010, while based in London, Kieran came to the aid of Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, who have been persecuted for exposing war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Kieran continues to work with the Assange campaign. So as a anti-war protester, my question is, one of the accusations that's leveled against Julian and WikiLeaks is that the unredacted Afghan war diaries endangered lives. Now, we know the track record of the war and the human toll of the war. Having said that, has the US or any of the authorities provided any evidence to support those allegations? that the Afghan war diaries did in fact lead to the death of informants.
Not at all. As my godson, actually, Ben Griffin, who was in the British paratroop regiment, one of the first soldiers to Afghanistan in the invasion, and then later in Baghdad with the SAS, points out that it wasn't any news to the Iraqi or Afghani people that these war crimes was happening to them on a daily basis. Who it was news to were us, located at the centres of empire, whether it be in the United States or Western Europe or Australia. And you know, the courage of Chelsea Manning. And it's quite interesting. I was the longest serving civilian resistor of the first Gulf War. I served 13 months in prison. But there were over 200 members of the US military who were sentenced to 6 months to 6 years for their non-violent resistance. And actually more resistance came out of the military than out of the civilian peace movement. And obviously Chelsea Manning bore the greatest burden of this with a 35-year sentence, and also tortured in Kuwait and at Quantico. So having met many veterans, British and also American people like Joshua Castile, who did interrogations at Abu Ghraib, over the years of this latest incarnation of this war, you know, they find great nourishment and solace out of the work of WikiLeaks. And you know, I was arrested. I'm 60 now. I was arrested when I was 30. As we disabled a B-52 bomber, and B-52s dropped 30% of everything that was dropped in those months of the Gulf War. And the B-52 we took out of action at an upstate New York base. Other B-52s were deployed from that base specifically to England, and they dropped napalm, cluster bombs, and fuel air explosives. Now, unfortunately, the peace movement kind of collapsed halfway through the aerial bombardment, and the nature of the war changed into the genocidal sanctions that killed over 1 million children in Iraq through the 1990s with very little resistance. There were small groups like Voices in the Wilderness who were breaking the sanctions. And what the sanctions of the first Gulf War did, they totally destroyed Iraqi civil society. They hardly touched the government or the power of Saddam Hussein. And the invasion of 2003, the escalation, finished off the government of Saddam Hussein. But the civil society had been destroyed in the 90s. And the work of WikiLeaks, I think, is significant because you know, the nature of warfare and how it's marketed in the centre of empire, whether it be Australia or Western Europe or the United States, has changed. Like obviously some people here are from the Vietnam era, where you had the conscription and the draft, and they learnt from that. And now all they ask us to do is to avert our gaze, to look the other way. And they found WikiLeaks such a threat because it puts, you know, I've just been watching the Claral murder footage here, and it's, you know, it's from the horse's mouth. It's actually US military footage of war crimes, and no one was charged for that. You know, the indiscriminate killing of the people in the street, and then, you know, you have the acts of mercy of the father taking his kids on the school run who stopped to try and save someone, and then they're butchered as well. You know, so WikiLeaks preserves life by exposing the crimes that are done in darkness, and hopefully will restrain the next crime. And that's why they've been targeted by the US military and the government, I think.
This is a question you both can answer. The press have this trope where they pretend to be objective and ask the question, Julian Assange, hero or villain? But they never talk about the heroism of Assange or WikiLeaks for exposing war crimes by our leaders and our soldiers. So I'd like to ask you the same question. Julian Assange, hero or villain?
Thank you, John. I've always been a bit sort of like irritated by that question. It never crossed my mind that Julian was anything other than, you know, a good man, principled and firm, righteous, and that was constantly demonstrated by the quality of the work that WikiLeaks produced and his commentary on the work that WikiLeaks produced and commentary on government and government structures and bureaucratic structures and how they work. So as for heroism, there's two illustrations I'd like to put before you. One is with collateral murder video. That is a package. We only ever see the video. There's two other videos involved in that package. One is the interview in Seda City by the surviving relatives of the photographer. And Kristen Hanifson negotiated permission to go to Seda City. And we see in the second video where the nephews and children see their relatives slaughtered and they collapse onto the floor in agony. An important thing in cherishing life is to give name to the dead, commemorate the dead. We do that all the time. And so the other aspect of Kristen's visit to Seda City was to name the balance of those people we saw murdered in the video. It wasn't possible. They couldn't find. They could only find, two names, the two photographers. All the rest swept away as refuse. That's a great crime and a great understanding of Julian and Kristen Hammerson to attempt to give names, to put a name to those we see killed in that video. The second one is the testimony in court. One of the witnesses is a man named El Masri. He was kidnapped in, it slipped my mind, Macedonia. He was kidnapped in Romania and on the border of Macedonia and sodomized and tortured and then delivered to the CIA in Egypt to be further tortured. Under torture, the CIA realised that they'd got the wrong chap and then flew him back to Germany. With the assistance of John Gertz, an investigative reporter, a close friend, and the WikiLeaks files, he was able to name the 13 CIA agents who had kidnapped and tortured El Masri. The judge in Munich, the Munich court, issued arrest warrants. The United States government said that if those arrest warrants are fulfilled, it will damage the relationship between the United States and Germany. We have all the cables on this. This is what I'm speaking of now, is communications between the United States Embassy in Germany and the United States Department of Secretary of State. That's their conversation. I'm just praising. Now, El Masri, in the morning he was going to testify, the barristers always test out the equipment, like this sort of equipment here that we're using, because it's they can't come to court because of the code. In the morning it works perfectly. Then El Masri comes on and to give his witness testimony, and it won't work. It cuts out, it cuts out, it cuts out. For 30 minutes in court they try and make the connection, but it's not possible. The witness testimony, live witness testimony, is abandoned. The judge and the prosecutor begin to devalue the importance of and then say that the court ought to move on and we can, file the witness statement and so on. Now, Julian's in a glass box up the back, about as far away as that cameraman. Ben is behind there. And that glass box has slots about that big, okay, and there's bulletproof glass. Julian stands up and said, I will not allow this court to censor the testimony of a torture victim. Now, Julian faces, in this court, 175 years, done a death sentence. But a special sort of death sentence, you get tortured to death. I'll explain that in a second. So he makes that statement twice in a row, and the court is shocked, and then the defence insists upon reading the testimony, and they read the testimony out. In fact, they read a gist, what they call a gist out. They shorten it for time. Well, that, I think, is a pretty strong example of courage, when you put yourself, even though you're facing death, you consider the circumstances of another human being. I think that's pretty good myself. Just to illuminate what tortured to death means, if Julian went to the United States, extradited to the United States under an espionage charge, he would be put in what they call a supermax prison. It would be in Colorado, a supermax in Colorado. He will also fall under what are called SAMs, as special administrative measures. I'm not making any of this up, it all happens to many people. These special administrative measures mean that you're in your cell for 23 hours a day. You're allowed out for 1 hour. That hour is to go to another cell exactly the same size. That's 8 foot by 6 foot. Okay, and it has a toilet inside. That's your exit. That cell is empty. It's got nothing in it. These people, there's a hole in the steel door. The guard comes past every half hour. I'll explain why. Every half hour the guard comes past, looks through the hole. There's no communication. You're in so they scream. In order to speak to somebody, they yell. The other one yells. The other one yells. 20 men screaming at each other in order to communicate, because you can't hear anybody unless they bellow. Some have been in there 10 years. Their minds are completely fractured. They scream anyway. They just join in the screaming. This hell-like cacophony emits. The guards come round every half hour to make sure you don't commit suicide. That is, you continue to suffer the insufferable. I think Julian standing up for that fellow, El Masri, and saying, I won't allow this court to not hear the testimony, to censor the testimony. I think that's pretty brave. Also, I think it's pretty brave of us to continue the fight, to ensure that Julian doesn't get put in these circumstances where it's so insufferable that you want to die, but they won't let you die. That's SAMs. These are real things. This depravity is actual since 2001. Anyway, I don't want to burden you with too much depravity But in the face of what would transpire to Julian Assange, fighting for El Masri, fighting for his testimony to be heard in a public court, is really important.
So, this question of Julian Assange, hero or villain, was actually the title of an attack piece by Paul Corners, and it evokes for me an old anarchist saying that if they offer you two options, always choose the third, you know. And I've always felt, say, to romanticise the people, whether it be Irish or Aboriginal or East Timorese, is a flip side and as racist as to demonise them. You know, humans are quite complex because we have freedom. And my observation of Julian, I've only known him since he's been under the hammer and in the sights of the US Empire and looking at a lifetime in jail, and which I imagine, you know, is a pretty stressful context. And what outrages me more than that question is, you know, The Guardian especially attacking him as someone who lacks empathy. And I think if you look closely at those attacks, what they actually are doing is weaponising his disability, that, you know, he may be on the Asperger's spectrum. And you know, I have lots of friends on that spectrum, and to weaponise that disability, to kind of present it falsely as arrogance or a lack of empathy is outrageous, you know. And the people making that accusation are usually very elitist and arrogant themselves. And I think what enrages the Brits about Julian, because there's such a class-ridden society over there, is that he does not know his place, you know. Unlike the Guardian journalist, he hasn't jumped through the hoops of Oxford and Cambridge. And, you know, this just enrages them. And especially the last year before he was extracted from the embassy, for 5 or 6 months I was living outside on the street, and to observe a place that had once been a sanctuary become a trap, and the cynical, and you know, half the staff were like sacked, and they brought in people who were hostile to him, and that in that very small space, and as we know, all the surveillance that occurred and spying on him there, I was, you know, really, really impressed with how resolute he was, and refusing to be intimidated. And like, you'd have even small things like the armed cops would just come screaming up the street and pull up outside the building and jump out with machine guns and shit like that, you know, just to freak him out. And that last year was very, very stressful, and I was very, very impressed how he always kept the initiative, you know, and remained human in that.
John, this is probably a question for you. The Australian government, we've seen in recent times, have rejected the charges against the British Australian academic colleague, Mo Gilbert. So Foreign Minister Marise Payne said in January, we don't accept the charges which under which she is detained, held, charged or convicted. Yet we see a very different story with Julian. Prime Minister Julia Gillard's first response to the American accusations against him in November 2010 was to say that he had broken the law. She couldn't, of course, identify the law, and she had to withdraw her comments. But we have had 4 prime ministers since then. I'm curious as to what assistance Australia has given Julian, if any, and to you and his family, the people who are sort of fighting for him, and how this compares with the kind of support that we traditionally give Australian citizens who are in foreign soil, who are customarily held under very questionable circumstances.
Thank you. As I'm in the process of asking the Australian government to act, I notice in my experience, if people call me names and then ask me for a favour, I'm very reluctant to do something. So I have to restrain myself a little bit. I think the pursuit of Julian is a sort of like a state-to-state hysteria that infected the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Australia. And that hysteria fulfills the desire of the United States to disguise its crimes. The crimes are tremendous. With the Australian government's action on behalf of Julian, there's Maurice Payne had spoken to Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State in the United States, and about Julian. Also to Dominic Raab, Secretary of State of the United Kingdom. Bronwood Bishop, under Malcolm Turnbull, raised the matter with Mike Pompeo, and at that time it was Jeremy Hunt, the Secretary of State of the UK. Both of these times, the reports come through to us through other sources that Mike Pompeo replied, "This is not at all interested in speaking about the matter. In other words, go away." I think that Kylie Moore Gilbert's circumstance demonstrate there were 3 Iranians exchanged for Kylie. So I think they demonstrate that it is possible for the Australian government to act. It is well within their capacity to simply indicate to Boris Johnson. By the way, Boris Johnson doesn't like the extradition treaty as it exists between the United States and the UK. He, as Mayor of London, successfully intervened in the Gary McKinnon case, and Gary wasn't extradited to the United States. Gary was an unusual man. He believed that the United States had records in the Pentagon of UFOs, so he hacked into the Pentagon's computers to find the evidence of UFOs. In the case of Laurie Love, Boris Johnson was an MP then. He was supportive of the non-extradition of Laurie Love. In the case of David Birmingham in 2006, he was very strongly supportive of David Birmingham, who was a constituent member, but David did end up being extradited to the United States. In Prime Minister's question time, last April, the last question as leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn asked, was to do with Julian. Boris Johnson didn't take the opportunity, as all other governments have, to say negative things about Julian. He was neutral about Julian and helpful on extradition. So we have some sympathy there. So it's a simple matter for the Australian government to speak diplomatically to Boris Johnson and have Julian take up the humanitarian visa that's been issued in Geneva. And that humanitarian visa has been issued in Geneva because Geneva has specialist hospitals for treating people who have undergone years of psychological torture. So this is a big opportunity for the Australian government to redeem itself in the treatment of Julian and have him assist to have Julian moved to Geneva to undergo rest and recuperation and proper treatment. There's no treatment for the sort of circumstances of 10 years psychological torture in a small cell in a maximum security prison where you can't speak to anybody for fear of getting COVID. And you can't speak to anybody because you're not allowed to, because they're under a sort of COVID lockdown. So this is easily repaired by our government. Thank you.
All right. Well, we've spent, I think 45 minutes already asking questions. So the idea of this is to also give the audience lots of time to ask questions. The audience who are present in the room and the audience who are watching the webinar. So I think it's time for us to move to an audience Q&A. And Jenny's got a question. All right. Ian, you'll answer that.
Hi John, and thank you very much for this opportunity to answer our questions. I have a question about the campaign to try to get Trump to free Julian and Edward Snowden before Trump, hopefully, concedes the presidency on the 20th of January. How hopeful are you of this outcome?
Hello, is that working?
Yeah.
Well, pretty hopeful. He's such an eccentric fellow, Donald Trump. You feel as though he could sort of like, okay, send him home. But seriously, there's a worldwide campaign and a lot of important people, well, not that we're unimportant, by the way, institutionally important people have written and signed the letter to President Trump. So the letter comes in two sections. One is ex-heads of state, ex-foreign ministers, ministers of government, judges and so on. And the other section, the other letter, is journalists and other people of that sort. So it's divided into two. And a lot of the gossip is a lot of Trump's journalist friends that he's worked with over the years have signed a letter asking Trump to extend the pardon.
What do you see as the potential ramifications of not being able to bring Julian Assange home for Australian media? And on the flip side of that, if we can manage to bring him home, how can we safeguard other journalists to avoid this kind of situation happening again in the future? Thank you.
Yes, if bringing Julian home comes about because we insist. It's on our shoulders. Okay, the government, if we didn't insist, would just make their state-to-state relationships and feel comforted thereby that they are able to service the United States interests. So that ensures that the government will be very wary of persecuting journalists in future. It's at our insistence that Julian be brought back to Australia. Also, this is a sort of a massive question. The implications in your questions are massive. I'll try and, and it's a favourite subject of mine, so I'll try and make it brief. In 1945, after a catastrophic world war, we brought into being a magnificent construction, the United Nations. inserted into the United Nations the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later on in 1958, the Conventions of Asylum, eventually ratified by UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, authored and organised by Australia in 1973. Us, we did it. And unusually, the UNGA voted 100 to 2 non-votes and 16 abstentions. It's very unusual. So it was a great victory. Also, the Council of Europe came into being, which solely looks after human rights. And then the European Court of Human Rights came into being. All of the human rights legislation in the Council of Europe is integrated and embraced in the nations of the Council of Europe, okay? So, and it's the same in Australia. So what Julian and WikiLeaks did was demonstrate that tremendous crimes, what they call crimes against humanity, that's crimes against us, not anybody else, not soldiers. Crimes against humanity are crimes against children, mothers, fathers, communities, grandmothers, uncles, aunties, all destroyed. That's what it is, a crime against humanity. And WikiLeaks has outlined many of them. War crimes. You can watch one there in the committal. One is a questionable war crime, the other is definitely a war crime. There's picking up this wounded man and this is a war crime. In other words, a crime against us. That's what it means. Not over there, but us right here. And so these great achievements of the later part of the 20th century are slowly, in an era of increasing barbarity, being undone. And you will see recently with David McBride that these crimes that were committed, they're counter-insurgency crimes committed in Afghanistan. They are policy. They are, the commanding officers may not know because they don't get the full flow of information. But you can see David McBride, Major, who specialises in this. He has, if you want to watch his latest small video, demonstrates to us that the flows of information will come to the General Staff, that is the level above community officers. They know these things are happening. They are aware of this. These are crimes against humanity, crimes against war crimes. We, at our insistence, they will stop. It's only because they attempt to pull the wool over our eyes, to bullshit to us, if you don't mind me using that word, to bullshit to us. And they do that by suppressing the information, by causing a young man, he was young then, 10 years ago, he's 39, a young man to spend 10 years in arbitrary detention and psychological torture, crucified in order to demonstrate to us that we don't complain, we don't reveal the crimes that they are committing against us. Lastly, there's a good man, academic, in Melbourne. His name is Gideon Polya. He's about my age, I think a little younger. His latest book, he's a specialist in excess deaths, how to calculate excess deaths. He estimates that, or calculates rather, that there are 6 million violent deaths in the Middle East since 2001. 6 million. That means 20 million people are grieving over the destruction of their loved ones, children, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunties, stacked up like trash. And we can only mention it as 7 million, and then it's disguised in an academic book. But they're people, you know. And so fighting for Julian brings a grain of justice to those grieving people. Lastly, there are 38 million refugees wandering the Middle East, their homes destroyed, their communities blown up. Julian and others' revelation of those crimes, David McBride, Chelsea Manning, will enable us and are enabling us to insist that our governments stop this heinous behaviour and obey the laws under which they exist, under which we give them permission to act on our behalf. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit strident, you forgive me, but I think it's important to say.
Now, Miles, you've got something, another question, have you?
We've got I think Kieran wanted to answer that.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, okay. Yeah.
Well, just to return to a few questions ago in terms of my own personal experience of the Australian government's advocacy in relation to someone in trouble with the United States politically, is that at the sentencing of ourselves in Syracuse, New York, over 100 Americans were thrown out of the courtroom for confronting the judge that they're about to legalise mass killing and criminalise peacemaking. And I remember the door opening and 3 guys in suits being ushered back in, and I turned to the court official and said, "Who are these guys?" And they said, "They're the guys from the Australian Embassy." So they'd been there the whole morning. They hadn't come up to me as an Australian citizen and said, "We're here to represent your civil rights and make sure you've been treated properly." They just hung out with the FBI all day. And if you look at the treatment of David Hicks, I mean, all they had to do was ask him back. Like Americans weren't sent to Guantanamo. British citizens were, Australian citizens were. And, the complete failure of people like Alexander Downer to do their well-paid jobs as High Commissioner in London, not even to visit Julian in Ecuadorian embassy or send anyone down there. Or I don't think they even observed the latest hearing. It's not only incompetence, it's a sycophancy that's at the deepest spiritual sickness of this country, is that we somehow seek security in serving empire and sending young men and now young women to kill and die in useless wars. We've been 19 years in Afghanistan, Iraq twice, first under Bob Hawke and the Labor Party, then under Howard and the Liberal Party, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, even to Northern Africa in World War II. World War I, we've been involved in about 12 wars, and only one, the war against the Japanese in the Pacific, can be described as defensive, And so the abandonment of Julian Assange is the flip side of sending our young men and women to Afghanistan to do terrible acts, and that are now being exposed, and also to come back and have high rates of suicide, etc., etc. We really have to address that, and they need to be challenged. They need to be pressured to do their jobs, I do hope, Julian gets a pardon, or that Boris Johnson does the right thing and stops the extradition hearing, or the law lords of the High Court turn the appeal around, or wherever this comes from. We need to free Julian, and we need to stop sending our young men and women to these wars. And our complicity with the butchering of East Timorese, where we trained Indonesian troops right near the city in jungle warfare training in Canungra. The heartbeat of Pine Gap. You rarely see those 2 words in the media, but that's the biggest contribution we make to the killing of innocent people throughout the US empire. And, all we're asked to do is be silent and sedated. And that's one thing Julian Assange has refused to do.
Is there another question from the audience which is present here?
Yes, I had one. You mentioned David Hicks there in that. I wonder if you see a parallel between what David Hicks' father did in that campaign to successfully get his son out of Guantanamo Bay and your situation with your son.
Yes, we chaps get a bad press over the last, 20 years or so. But I think it's a bit wrong. I found in my own experience, I have very close friends, around my age or down to 60, who fight tooth and nail for their kids, as David did. One friend, two of his children have went off the rails, like 10 years ago. He still goes up to their houses or wherever they're living and picks up their lives and, restarts them again. So that's what I don't know whether it's an Australian phenomenon, but that's what I've found us men here. When we're called upon, we're pretty solid. And David was, and I hope I managed as well as David did.
Are there any more questions?
We have a stream from a question from Tristan Sykes on the live stream from Free Assange Hobart. They're asking, what is the most pertinent aspect of the persecution of Julian Assange? Is it the abuse of process and rule of law? Is it the violent opposition to truth? Or is it the nature of power exposed?
Well, of course the nature of power is exposed critically and clinically in all its what you rampaging elements. The great contribution of the English people was that placing a shield between the sovereign or the state and the people, and that was called law. They both had to obey. It's only at our strong insistence, I feel this, it's only at our strong insistence that shield be held up and both sides continue to obey.
Do you want to say something?
I guess I'm speaking from the perspective of a former and probably future anti-war prisoner, and I think when we march against war, as millions did in 2003 and 2 million in London did, what we are doing, we're inciting people to non-violently resist that war, whether they be in civilian life or in military life. And if we're involved in inciting them, we're obligated to accompany them through the courts and through their imprisonment or hospitalisation or whatever they go through. And that the years I lived in London and spent outside the embassy and etc., that bothered me the most. What were people thinking when they marched against it in 2003? What were the Labor Party in this country thinking when they marched in those wars and against those wars? And the Green Party and others, when you have an Australian incarcerated and looking, it's like spending a lifetime incarcerated for exposing those wars. And we have to build in our social movements a sensitivity and rituals to support prisoners. Whether if we have a serious peace movement or environmental movement, we are going to take casualties and have prisoners, and we have to know. We have to know what to do, and we've got to keep them visible. We've got to advocate for them, You know, and especially if you're ever in hospital or jail, you really need people on the outside advocating for you. You know, they're dangerous places, both those places, and the more solidarity you experience as a prisoner, the easier it is to continue the resistance. And you know, the two things that sustained me through 2 years of incarceration have been your spirituality and the solidarity of others. And I know Julian's got a very specific and admirable spirituality of sense of self and purpose and the work he does. And it's our job to, and he will draw nourishment as we continue the struggles for peace and justice and the environment. And we should write to him and tell him about what we're doing, you know, and vice versa. I draw nourishment that Julian Assange has refused to surrender to this war machine.
The internet, Miles?
Adam Porter from Melbourne asks, how do we get the Australian government to redeem itself with regards to the treatment of Julian?
How do we get them? Well, there's two fundamental ways. Every single MP has a phone number. I ring them up all the time. I rang the local member for Richmond, I think it's called Richmond, this morning. So every single one of them's got a phone number. Meet with friends and discuss things. Healthy people, you know, when you find a problem, you work out a way to act. So people coming together with the aim of acting to assist, bring about the freedom of Julian, automatically spreads. You don't have to, you know, worry too much. It'll automatically spread if you just involve yourself. That's all. That's how human beings are, like we are here today. There's a website. It's writejulian.com. That's W-R-I-T-E, Julian, writejulian.com. And that has all the information there that you could send Julian a card or a letter, or, you know, whatever you like. So that allows you to express solidarity, and in doing that, the jail sees the cards, and that goes back to the government that there is support in this community for Julian Assange. I don't want to, you know, I'll do it. There's 3 films being made on Julian, 3 documentaries. We're here involved in one of them. The other one's Eugene Jarecki, and the third one is Gunder Wallraff, German famous man. There are 3 books. There are 186 websites, Facebook pages, and so on. There was a demonstration in Sydney on Sunday, a demonstration in Auckland, a demonstration in Adelaide, one that I was involved in Melbourne. There'll be another one on the 20th in Melbourne, there'll be another one on the 20th. The ferment is tremendous. Just join in and we'll be able to bring Julian home, and the government will redeem itself in our eyes as a defender of its citizen, and consequently the government's ease of authority, when we believe in it, will increase. It's a win-win for everybody.
Do you want to say something about that, Kieran? That question?
Well, tomorrow we're gathering at Bunyappa Park at 5 o'clock, taking it to the streets. And yeah, I think, you know, obviously people are given have different gifts, and it's important to bring whatever you can to those acts of solidarity. And yeah, you know, 4 years ago, Chelsea Manning was freed from imprisonment and had a sentence commuted. No, that totally surprised me. So I'm quite willing to be surprised again, you know.
All right, we've got another question from the internet. So, Miles?
Rod Lemon from Toowoomba asks, why has Nils Melzer never written to the Australian government criticising their lack of support for Julian?
Nils Melzer's brief doesn't allow him to write to the Australian government, as the governments that were involved in the committal of the misdemeanours, malfeasances and misfeasances against Julian are the Swedish government, the United Kingdom, and secondarily the United States, but primarily the United Kingdom and Sweden. You could say, I don't know whether Nils Melzer's, I can't remember it, I've read his report a number of times, but I can't remember it saying that silence is complicity. However, we can say that silence by our government makes us feel as though they are acquiescing to this treatment.
All right. All right, well, one more. We've got questions from the audience here, but we'll get one more from Miles via the internet.
This will be a quick one. It's a follow-up from Tristan Sykes in Hobart. He wants to know, John Shipton, are you planning to come to Tasmania?
Yes, yes, Tristan. I'll come down in the new year, about the end of January. I'll be there with Peter and Peter, Greg, and Andrew. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Jenny, you've got another question.
Do you know if Julian is receiving all of his mail unadulterated, even if it contains examples of protests and campaigns for him?
Yes, they don't like. He gets all his mail. What they don't like is directions on how to make hooch. They don't like that. So that he doesn't get any of those. So don't send any directions on how to make vinegar. It won't get through. But all the rest of the stuff he gets.
One more. Another question from Miles.
Sharon Ferrick from Bundaberg is asking, John Shipton, is the Australian media supporting or hindering your efforts to free Julian with their reporting of Julian's fight to return home? Are they accurately reporting the facts of the case?
You know, again, I face the problem. I don't want to criticise the media because I want them to act in Julian's interest, and I don't think whipping people gets you anywhere. So, with that said, over the last 5 years, the media, mass media, has been less than sympathetic to Julian, and the consequence has eroded their own prestige and power. I'll make that more plain. That enables the government to raid journalists' homes, offices, and so on. The erosion of their prestige and power enables the government to oppress and harass journalists. So solidarity and unity with Julian will protect journalists against intimidation by government. That's very clear.
All right, another question from Miles.
A question from the live stream. Adam Porter in Melbourne asks, should we be insisting on a royal commission of the Australian Embassy?
Commissioner.
The exact The exact wording of the question is, should we be insisting on a royal commission of the Australian Embassy?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see Julian freed and being able to present evidence to a High Commission on Australia's involvement in the Iraq War. That's what I would like to see. Yeah.
There are a question on the stream from John August. How might we increase public awareness in Australia of the contradictions and hypocrisy in foreign policy? What might we hope for?
Yeah, I think you have to seriously consider where you find security. And, you know, even people like Malcolm Fraser, before they passed away, were coming to the conclusion that alliances don't always bring you security. And he made the observation that the only reason we ended up invading the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey as it later became, was that we were in alliance with Britain and Turkey was in alliance in Germany. There wasn't any major conflict between Turkey and Australia. And that's where alliances sometimes get you. And we'd really have to deconstruct our past. And, you know, that we have troops in Afghanistan is not even debated, even when we discover what they're doing in terms of killing children. That we have an air force bombing in Syria in the Middle East. That Pine Gap does what it does. These have all become kind of Muzak, and you know, what role do we play, and what do we get out of it, you know, and who suffers for it, you know, and you know, we hype these kids up to join the military, to send them off, and we often abandon them, and you know, that's a tragedy. But a worse tragedy is what they've done to people over there, out of sight and out of mind, in Afghanistan, Iraq, in Syria. And this war is both escalated and it's expanded into Yemen and into Libya. And you know, it's not part of even debate when there's an election or this. It's so we really need to wake up, you know, and we need help doing that. And obviously WikiLeaks was helping us do that.
All right, are there any more questions from the audience? All right, John Ransley's got a question.
There you go, John. Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for the extraordinary seminar that you've organised. There was an earlier point, I think John mentioned the importance of naming the people that have been killed. And that reminded me of Robert Fisk, who just recently died, which was one of his particular pursuits in investigating American war crimes, basically in the Middle East, was to identify the names of the people. He would list them all in his columns, and he's a great loss to journalism. One of the best journalists in the Middle East, in my opinion. And there's no one else of his stature or his experience, background and so on to replace him. So, but just that point about the importance of naming those people, I thought was a really good one.
Richard Medhurst is Arabic-speaking, German-speaking and English. He seems to be taking the spirit of
All right, have we got any more statements or questions from the audience? Well, in that case then, it's probably a good time to sort of close this down, and I'd like to, thank all the people who came. Particularly like to thank Miles Whittaker and Ian Kerr. We've had a lot of problems doing this with equipment and various miscarriages, but and various people whispering too loudly. Not that I'm going to name who they were. But
Thanks for throwing me under the bus. I'm getting it.
But yeah, so, and I'd particularly like to thank the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance for help supporting this, and I'd like to, thank the Pirates Party, the Pirate Party, not the Pirates Party, I guess it's singular, for organising the through Miles the webinar, and also for hosting it on their website. And I'd like to thank all of you who came here tonight, and I'd particularly like to thank Kieran O'Reilly. I was going to say veteran anti-war activist, I think I should, and particularly John Shipton for coming here and sort of speaking so eloquently about the issues involved with the torture and the attempt to destroy Julian by the national security state for revealing their war crimes.